My name is Earl McKenna. I've spent more years on the water than I have on solid ground, and I've got the salt in my joints to prove it. They call me a storyteller, but I don't tell stories. I tell the truth, even when the truth sounds like a fever dream. What I'm about to tell you happened in the summer of '82, down in the Florida Keys, where the water is so blue it looks like ink, and the secrets run deeper than the Mariana Trench. The tide is coming. The heat in the Florida Straits back in the summer of 1982 wasn't just hot. It was a heavy, living thing that sat on your chest and dared you to breathe. It was the kind of heat that made the horizon wobble like a drunkard, blurring the line where the ocean ended and the sky began. I remember looking out over the stern of the Marauder, my 30-foot Bertram, and thinking that the world looked like it was melting. The air smelled of diesel fumes, old bait, and that thick copper tang of ozone that usually comes before a storm, even though the sky was a sheet of polished steel without a single cloud to break the glare. I was younger then, though I didn't feel it. The sea has a way of aging a man from the inside out, eroding your patience and your cartilage in equal measure. I was fishing with a man we called Dutch. His real name was Arthur, but he'd never answered to it a day in his life. Dutch was a mountain of a man, quiet giant from the backwoods of Georgia, who had hands the size of shovels and a silence about him that was louder than most people's shouting. We had been running charters together for 5 years, chasing blue marlin for tourists with too much money and too little respect for the ocean. But that day, we were alone. No client, no chatter, just two men and the vast, indifferent Atlantic trying to pull something worthwhile from the deep. We had drifted out past the shelf, way out where the water turns from turquoise to a purple so dark it looks like a bruise. It was marlin territory, the kind of water where giants sleep. We had 4 lines out, skipping ballyhoo across the surface, the riggers creaking rhythmically with the swell. But despite the perfect conditions, the ocean was dead. Dead. Usually, you see life. You see flying fish skittering away from the hull. You see frigate birds circling high up in the thermals. You see the occasional dorsal fin of a spinner shark cutting the wake. That day, nothing. The surface was a mirror of oil. It was unsaid. I've always believed that the sea talks to you if you know how to listen. And that afternoon, it was holding its breath. It felt like walking into a room where 2 people had just stopped arguing the moment you opened the door, the silence thick with tension. "Feels wrong, Earl," Dutch grunted from the helm. He was wiping grease off his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. Dutch wasn't a man given to superstition. He was a mechanic, a creature of nuts, bolts, and logic. If an engine knocked, he fixed it. If a line snapped, he tied a new leader. For him to say something felt wrong was enough to make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Just the heat, Dutch," I lied, though I didn't believe it myself. I checked the drag on the starboard reel for the 10th time. Pressure must be dropping. Maybe a squall is building up south of Cuba. "Ain't no squall," he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dark water. "Water's too still. Even the current feels lazy. Something spooked the life out of this patch." He was right. I moved to the fighting chair, testing the swivel. It swung smoothly, but the metal was hot enough to burn skin. I poured myself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the thermos, staring at the bait skipping behind us. They looked pathetic, lifeless things dancing for an audience that wasn't there. I checked my watch. It was just past 2 in the afternoon. The sun was high, hammering down on the fiberglass deck, baking us alive. I was about to tell Dutch to pull them in, to suggest we head back to Key West for cold beer and try again tomorrow, when the universe decided to wait. It didn't happen like it does in the movies. There was no dramatic music, no sudden splash. It started with a click, a single, sharp click from the big pin senator reel on the port corner, and silent. I froze, coffee cup halfway to my mouth. Dutch stopped wiping his hands. We both stared at that rod. It bowed slightly, just a tip of the hat, and then snapped back. "Current?" Dutch asked, stepping down from the helm. "No," I whispered. "Wait." And then the world exploded. The reel didn't just scream, it howled. The line tore off the spool with such violence that smoke literally puffed up from the drag washer. The rod bent double, the fiberglass groaning under a strain that shouldn't have been. I dropped my coffee and scrambled for the rod, jamming the butt into the gimbal of the fighting chair. "Back her down! Back her down!" I roared, buckling the harness around my waist. Dutch was already at the throttles, throwing the engines into reverse. The water churned white around the stern as the marauder fought to keep up with whatever locomotive had grabbed our bait. The line was singing that high-pitched, terrifying note that means it's pushed to the breaking point. 600 yards of monofilament vanished in less than 30 seconds. "What is it?" Dutch yelled over the roar of the engines. "Marlin. A blue?" I cranked the handle, trying to gain an inch, but it was like trying to reel in a falling elevator. My arms screamed in protest. "No!" I shouted back, gritting my teeth as the harness dug into my kidneys. "It's not jumping. A blue would be airborne by now. This thing is digging. It's heading for the bottom." It felt heavy. That's the only word I can use. Not just heavy in terms of weight, but heavy in spirit. It felt ancient. When you hook a marlin, it feels frantic, electric. This felt like I had snagged a submarine. The power was rhythmic, mechanical, unstoppable. Thump, thump, thump. Every tail beat sent a shock wave up the line, through the rod, and into my spine. "Tuna?" Dutch asked, his eyes wide, scanning the line disappearing into the abyss. "Too big for a tuna," I grunted, sweat stinging my eyes. "And too mean?" It's shaking its head. I can feel it tearing at the hook. It's a shark, a big one. We fought that fish for 2 hours. The sun began to dip, casting long, bloody shadows across the water, turning the deep blue into a sinister gray. My shoulders were on fire. My hands were cramping into claws. Every time I gained 50 yards, the beast would decide it wanted them back and take 100. It was a stalemate, a test of will between a man in a fiberglass box and a monster in its own element. But there was something else, the unease I had felt earlier. That wrongness Dutch had mentioned hadn't gone away with the adrenaline. It had gotten worse. As I fought, I found myself looking over my shoulder. I felt exposed in the fighting. The ocean around us was still unnervingly calm. No birds came to investigate the commotion. No other fish surfaced. It was as if we were in a quarantine zone. The water thick, oily. "He's tiring!" Dutch shouted, pointing. The angle of the line was rising. The fish was coming up. I pumped and reeled, finding a rhythm born of desperation. I wanted this thing alongside the boat. I wanted to see what had the power to tow a 30-foot boat against the drag. I wanted to look it in the eye and assert my dominance, to prove that I was predator here. "Get the gaff, Dutch." "The flying gaff," I ordered, my voice raspy. Dutch grabbed the heavy stainless steel hook attached to a thick rope. He moved to the gunwale, leaning over, peering into the murky depths. The color came first, a flash of ghostly white, deep down in the purple gloom. It was wide, impossible. "Good Lord," Dutch whispered. The shape materialized. It was a great white shark, but not just any white. This was a matriarch, a prehistoric relic. She must have been 18, maybe 20 feet long. Her girth was like a Volkswagen Beetle. As she spiraled up, tired but still defiant, I saw the black doll eyes staring up at us, void of anything resembling fear. She was magnificent and terrifying, a perfect killing machine evolved over millions of years. "Careful, Dutch. Watch the leader," I yelled, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. We had won. We had beaten the apex predator. I felt a surge of pride, that primal victory that every fisherman chases. I was already thinking about the photo, the story at the bar, the look on the faces of the tourists back at the dock. But then the line went slack. not broken, just heavy, dead weight. The shark had stopped fighting. It hadn't spit the hook. It hadn't snapped the line. It just stopped. She gave up? Dutch asked, confused, holding the gaff ready. I don't know, I said, reeling in the slack rapidly. Something's not right. She stopped swimming. I cranked the handle, bringing the massive fish closer to the surface. She drifted up, rolling slightly in the swell, and that's when the smell hit us. It wasn't just the fishy smell of a shark's slime coat. It was the metallic, hot scent of fresh blood. A lot of it. Earl! Dutch's voice trembled. He backed away from the gunwale. What? What is it? I stood up from the chair, unclipping the harness, my legs shaking from exhaustion. Look at the water, Dutch said, pointing. A massive plume of red was blossoming up from beneath the shark, staining the indigo water sickly crimson. It was spreading fast, like ink in water, bubbling up with horrifying intensity. Did she gut hook? Is she bleeding out? I asked, moving to the side of the boat to look. No, Dutch was, his face pale beneath his tan. Something else is down there. I looked over the side. The great white broke the surface. At first, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. I saw the massive head, the iconic snout, the dorsal fin cutting the air. But as the swell rolled the shark onto its side, the reality hit me like a physical blow. The shark was dead, but it hadn't died from exhaustion. The water around the boat began to vibrate, not from the engine, which was idling. The vibrations coming from the hull itself, a low-frequency hum that rattled the fillings in my teeth. The ocean's surface, previously so calm, began to tremble. "Dutch, get back!" I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the center of the cockpit. "What in God's name?" Dutch stammered, staring at the carcass drifting alongside us. We stood there, paralyzed, as the water around the dead shark began to swirl. A whirlpool was forming, not from a drain, but from displacement. Something massive was moving directly beneath us. The 20-foot great white, the apex predator, the king of the ocean, was bobbing there like a cork. And then I saw the wound. I gripped the gunwale, my knuckles white, my breath caught in a throat that felt like it was filled with sand. I had spent my life on the sea. I had seen propellers slice manatees. I had seen orcas tear apart seals. But I had never, in 50 years, seen anything like this. The shark wasn't just dead. It had been sampled. I stared at the water, waiting for the monster to show itself, while the blood turned the Atlantic into a slaughterhouse floor. The silence of the afternoon was gone, replaced by the sound of water shifting against something colossal. And for the first time in my life, on the deck of my own boat, I didn't feel like a fisherman. I felt like bait. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat. It was a silence so profound, the slap of the water against the fiberglass hull sounded like gunshot. I stood there, gripping the gunwale, my knuckle white as bleached coral, staring at the carcass of the great white. You have to understand the scale of this. We are not talking about a reef shark. We are not talking about something you see in an aquarium. This was a matriarch of the deep, a creature that had ruled these waters since Nixon was in office. She was massive, slate-gray cylinder of muscle and bad attitude, and half of her was gone. Dutch was the first to speak, but his voice didn't sound like his own. It was thin, reedy, stripped of all that Georgia backwoods confidence. "Earl, where is the rest of her?" I couldn't answer. I couldn't take my eyes off the wound. It wasn't a tear. When an orca hits a shark, it's messy. They rip, they shake, they tear the liver out. This wasn't that. This was surgical. It was a clean, crescent-shaped cut that had severed the shark just behind the pectoral fin. The spine, a column of cartilage as thick as a man's thigh, had been sheared through as if it were a twig. I leaned over the side, gagging slightly at the overwhelming stench of copper and raw meat that was steaming in the hot air. I needed to see the bite mark clearly. I needed to quantify it, to measure it against the things I knew to be real, because my brain was refusing to accept what my eyes were seeing. The radius of the bite. Lord have mercy. The arc of the missing flesh perfectly smooth. I visualized the jaw that could make such a mark. I looked at the tire of a tractor once, back on my uncle's farm in Alabama, one of those massive black rubber monsters used for plowing deep clay. That's what this looked like. The bite mark was the size of a tractor tire. A single bite, a single closing of jaws that had to be wide enough to swallow a Volkswagen Beetle whole without touching the side. "Start the engines, Dutch?" I whispered. "What?" He was staring at the water, mesmerized by the horror of it. "Start the damn engines!" I roared, breaking the spell. "Put her in gear! We need to move!" Dutch scrambled back to the helm, his boots slipping on the wet deck. He turned the key, and the twin diesels rumbled to life. The vibration usually comforted me, a reminder of man's mechanical mastery over nature. Today, it felt pathetic, a noisy toy buzzing on the surface of an indifferent abyss. "Which way?" Dutch yelled, his hand hovering over the throttles. "Shallow water," I shouted back. "Head for the shelf. Get us into 20 feet of water now." But before he could engage the transmission, the Marauder lurched. It wasn't a wave. The sea was still glassy, unnervingly flat. The boat lifted, not from the bow or stern, but bodily, straight up, as if a giant hand had placed a palm flat against the keel and pushed. We rose maybe 6 inches, hung there for a heart-stopping second, and then slammed back down with a bone-jarring crash that rattled every rod in the holder. "We hit something!" Dutch screamed, grabbing the wheel for balance. "No," I said, cold realization washing over me like ice water. "We didn't hit anything. Something hit us." I looked at the depth sounder mounted on the console. The screen, usually a reliable graph of the bottom contours, was having a seizure. It was flashing numbers that made no sense. 300 feet, 50 feet, 10 feet, error. The sonar was painting a solid block of red directly under the hull. "It's under us," I breathed. "It's right under the boat." The water around the shark carcass, which was still tethered to our line, began to boil. It wasn't the frantic splashing of feeding fish. It was a displacement of water so massive it looked like a submarine was breaching. The ocean swelled, rising in a smooth, dark mound that lifted the dead great white out of the water, and then I skinned. It broke the surface just for a second, rolling in the wake of its own movement. It wasn't white like a shark or black like a whale. It was a mottled prehistoric gray, scarred and pitted like the surface of the moon. It looked like wet concrete, and the texture, it was rough, comprised of scales or denticles the size of dinner plates. I saw a dorsal fin, or what I assumed was a dorsal fin. It rose from the water, a tombstone, tattered and jagged on the trailing edge, covered in barnacle, trailing weed. It kept rising and rising and rising. It stood at least 6 feet out of the water, and it was still coming. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Dutch whispered. He was crossing himself, something I hadn't seen him do in all the years I'd known him. The smell changed then. The scent of fresh blood was overpowered by something else, a smell of decay, of ancient mud, of the bottom of the world dredged up to the light. It was a musk so thick you could taste it, oily and foul. "Cut the line!" Dutch yelled, reaching for the fillet knife we kept on the bait station. "Earl, cut the damn line! It's coming for the rest of it! Don't touch it!" I barked. "If you cut that tension, the backlash might wrap the prop. Just back us off." Dutch threw the levers into reverse, and the propellers bit into the water. The Marauder shuddered and began to back away, pulling the dead shark with us for a moment before the drag on the reel started screaming again. But we weren't moving fast enough. The water behind the dead shark imploded. It wasn't a splash. It was a hole opening in the ocean. A vortex formed, swirling with terrifying speed. The carcass of the great white, all 1,000 pounds of what was left of it, was sucked down into that hole. The rod in the holder bent violently, the tip touching the water. The 80-pound test line, which held the shark earlier, snapped like a piece of sewing thread. The sound was like a rifle shot. Crack! and the recoil sent the rod whipping back so hard it shattered the fiberglass holder. We were free, but we weren't safe. Go, go, go! I was shouting now, abandoning all pretense of calm. Dutch jammed the throttles forward, the bow rose, and we started to plane, digging out of the hole we were in. But as we gathered speed, I looked back. The wake of the boat wasn't closing. Behind us, in the churning white water, a shadow was keeping pace. It was vast, a dark stain, moving beneath the surface, easily matching our 20 knots. It was longer than the boat, much longer. I grabbed the radio mic, my hand shaking so bad I almost dropped it. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Vessel Marauder." I stopped. What was I going to say? "Mayday, we are being chased by a sea monster." "Mayday, a dinosaur just ate my shark." The Coast Guard would think I was drunk or suffering from heat stroke. I stared at the mic, then slammed it back into the cradle. No one out here. "It's gaining on us, Earl." Dutch's voice was high, bordering on hysteria. He was looking at the depth sounder again. The red blob was right under the transom. "Zigzag," I ordered. "Don't let it get a lock on the props. If it hits the running gear, we're dead in the water." Dutch spun the wheel hard to port. The boat banked sharply, throwing me against the bait station. I scrambled up, looking over the stern. As we turned, the momentum of the creature carried it forward, and for one brief, terrifying moment, it passed alongside us. The water was clear enough for me to see the outline. It was serpentine, but thick, with paddle-like limbs that churned the water with terrifying. It had a head that looked like crocodile, but wider, blunter, armored with bone. And the eye, as it glided past just 10 feet below the surface, an eye rolled up to look at me. It was the size of a dinner plate, a milky, pale yellow orb, slit pupil that seemed to glow with a cold, malignant intelligence. It didn't look like a fish's eye. It looked like the eye of something that remembered when the continents were one. It saw me. I know it did. It looked right through the fiberglass, right through my skin, and into the terrified little man hiding inside. It wasn't hungry. It was curious, and that was almost worse. "It's turning!" Dutch screamed. The shadow banked, a massive curve of darkness against the blue, coming around for another pass. The displacement wave from its turn hit us broadside, nearly capsizing the boat. Water flooded over the gunwale, soaking my boots. "It's playing with us," I muttered, realizing the truth. If it wanted to sink us, it could have done it already. It could have come up beneath us, shattered the hull like an eggshell. It was testing, or maybe it was saving us for later, like a cat with a mouse. "Ha! Flares!" I shouted. "Dutch, where is the flare gun?" "In the ditch bag, under the console." I scrambled on my hands and knees, the deck pitching wildly as the creature's wake battered us. I ripped open the orange safety bag and found the plastic pistol and a box of red meteor flares. I loaded one, my fingers fumbling. I stood up, bracing my legs against the fighting chair. The shadow was coming straight for the stern, a torpedo of darkness aimed right at our engine. "Keep her steady!" I yelled. I raised the flare gun, aiming not at the sky, but at the water directly behind the boat, right where that massive head would be breaking the surface. "Come on, you devil!" I hissed through gritted teeth. "Come and get a taste." The water bulled, a snout broke the surface, a wall of gray, scarred flesh rushing toward us at 30 miles an hour. I saw the teeth then, rows of them, conical, interlocking, stained brown. I pulled the trigger. The trigger broke cleanly, a small mechanical snap that sounded absurdly insignificant against the roaring backdrop of our imminent death. The flare gun kicked against my palm, not with the recoil of a rifle, but with a dull, hollow thud. The meteor didn't fly into the sky. It flew straight into the face of the nightmare. The magnesium charge ignited about 10 feet off the water, right as it met the oncoming wall of gray flesh. For a split second, the world turned a blinding, searing red. The flare hissed, a sound like bacon hitting a hot skillet, magnified 1,000 times as it struck the water just inches from that ancient prehistoric snout. I didn't hit the creature. I wasn't aiming to kill it. You don't kill a mountain with a pebble. I wanted to startle it. I wanted to blind it. And God help me, it worked. The creature didn't roar. Fish don't have vocal cords. And whatever this thing was, it was of the sea. But the water screamed. The massive head thrashed violently to the left, avoiding the intense heat and blinding light of the burning phosphor. The motion was so violent, so powerful, that it sent a sheet of water crashing over the stern of the marauder, knocking me off my feet. I slammed into the fighting chair, the wind knocked out of me, salt water flooding my eyes. "Dutch, punch it, now!" I wheezed, scrambling to find purchase a slick deck. Dutch didn't need telling twice. The engines howled as he pushed the throttles past the red line. The propellers bit into the turbulent water, cavitating for a terrifying second before finding grip. The bow of the Bertram shot up toward the sky, and we leaped forward, surfing down the displacement wave the monster had created. I dragged myself to the stern, shielding my eyes against the spray, looking back into the red-tinged mist. The flare was still burning, bobbing on the surface, casting eerie, flickering shadows across the swells. Beside it, the water was churning. I saw a tail, God, it must have been 10 feet wide, slap the surface with the sound of a thunderclap. And then, with a fluidity that defied its size, the creature arched its back and dove. It didn't sink. It drove itself down. A massive whirlpool formed where it had been, sucking the dying light of the flare down into the abyss with it. The red glow grew fainter, deeper, turning from a firework into a dying ember until finally the darkness of the deep Atlantic swallowed it whole. We were alone. "Don't stop!" I yelled over the roar of the engines. Though Dutch had no intention of slowing, he was hunched over the wheel, his knuckles white, staring straight ahead at the compass. We ran like thieves fleeing a crime scene. We ran until the temperature gauges on the dash were pinning the danger zone. The smell of hot oil was filling the cabin. We ran for an hour, cutting a straight white scar across the ocean, heading relentlessly north-northeast toward the safety of the shelf. I didn't leave the stern. I stood there, holding the gaff, watching wake. Every shadow in the water, every patch of seaweed, every change in the ripple pattern made my heart stop. I expected that dorsal fin to rise again, to slice through our wake like a reaper's scythe. I expected the boat to shudder and stop as jaws clamped onto the propellers. But nothing came. The ocean had returned to that same eerie, glass-like calm. It was as if the violence of the last hour never happened. The only evidence was the broken rod holder, the water sloshing on the deck, and the terror etched into the lines of my face. When the color of the water finally changed, shifting from that bottomless, terrifying indigo to the comforting, sandy turquoise of the shallows, I felt my knees give out. I slumped onto the bait cooler, burying my face in my hand. We were in 30 feet of water. Things like that. They don't come into the shallow. They belong to the dark. They belong to the pressure and the cold. Dutch slowed the boat. The roar of the engines died down to a burble, and the silence rushed back in to fill the space. But this wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of the deep. This was the familiar silence coast, the sound of seagulls, the distant hum of other boats, the lap of gentle waves against the hull. Dutch turned off the engines and let us drift. He walked out to the cockpit, his legs unsteady. He looked at me, then at the empty ocean behind us. He didn't say a word. He just reached into the cooler, pulled out 2 cold beers, cracked them open, and handed one to me. We drank in silence. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, colors that felt too beautiful for the day we had just survived. "What was it, Earl?" Dutch asked finally. His voice was raspy, sounding like it had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. I looked at the beer bottle, watching the condensation run down the glass. I don't know, Dutch, and I don't want to know. People won't believe us, he said, looking at the broken gear. They'll say we hooked a sub or that we're drunk. Let them, I replied. Better they think we're liars than they know what's really down there. We docked the Marauder in Key West just as stars were coming out. We cleaned the boat in silence. We didn't talk about the missing shark. We didn't talk about the bite mark the size of a tractor tire. We washed the blood off the deck, shark blood, we told us, and stowed the gear. Dutch Arthur quit the next day. He didn't make a big scene about it. He just came by my house, handed me his keys to the boat locker, and said he was moving inland, said he had a cousin in Tennessee who needed help with a hardware store. He said he wanted to live somewhere where the water was only deep enough to bathe in. I didn't blame him. I shook his hand, and I never saw him again. As for me, well, a fisherman has to fish. It's not just what I do, it's who I am. But I changed. I stopped chasing the deep blue. I sold the heavy tackle. I stopped running charters to the shelf. I stuck to the reefs, to the flats, to the places where I could see the bottom. People whispered that Earl McKenna had lost his nerve, that I had gotten too old for the big game. They'd sit in the bars and brag about the marlin they hooked or the swordfish they fought at midnight, and I'd just nod and smile into my drink. Let them brag. They play in a playground they think they own. They drop their lines and their nets with the arrogance of children, thinking the ocean is just a resource, a larder to be raided. They don't know that they are guests. I still go out to the end of the pier sometimes at night. Tide is high and the moon is full. I look out past the lights of the harbor, out to where the black water meets the black sky, and I listen. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I think I can hear it. A low, rhythmic displacement of water, a sound too deep for the ears, but clear to the bones. It's a reminder. The ocean doesn't belong to us. We build our ships and draw our charts. We name the currents and map the trenches, but it's all just a veneer. Beneath the surface, in the cold, the dark, the old things still rule. They were here before we crawled out of the mud, and they will be here long after we're gone. That day in 1982 taught me the only lesson that really matters for a man who lives by the sea. You are not the master of the water. You are barely even a visitor. You are a tolerance. And sometimes, if you look too deep, if you greedily pull too much from the darkness might just decide to pull back. So, keep your eyes on the horizon, and if the water ever goes quiet, too quiet, and the birds stop flying, and the air feels heavy, reel in your lines, start your engine, and run. Humility is not a weakness. It is a survival instinct. We walk through this world thinking we are at the top of the food chain, but there are boundaries we are not meant to cross. Respect the unknown, for there are monsters in the deep, be they in the ocean or in life, that are not meant to be fought, only survive. If this story sent a shiver down your spine and made you think twice about dipping your toes in deep water, do this old fisherman a favor. Smash that subscribe button and like the video. It helps me keep the lantern lit and the stories coming. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your hooks sharp.